Hi, everyone. Thanks for hopping on this webinar with us today, Crafting Your Science Message for Journalists. So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself and my colleagues, let you know who we are. I'm Shane Hanlon. I'm part of AGU's Sharing Science program. I'm a scientist by training and now a science communicator / science communication trainer. And I think we have Olivia on the phone.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Olivia Ambrogio. I'm also a biologist by training, also with a cold right now, so that's why I'm sounding like a giant nose. My apologies. And I'm also part of the Sharing Science program, trying to help our scientists communicate to wider audiences in more compelling ways.
Great. And then we also, in the room with me, we have Nancy.
Hi, I am Nancy Bompey. I am the manager of AGU's Public Information Office, which we work with the Sharing Science program a lot. We are the press office, the science press office at AGU. We mainly publicize stuff published in our journals and at our meetings. Before doing this, I was a reporter too, so I'm happy to answer your questions at the end.
Yeah, so Nancy's here to make sure we get it all right and to help us with answering any questions y'all might have. And so logistics just throughout, if you have questions throughout, there's a questions box in your little GoToMeeting tab. So if you have any questions, you can ask them in there and we'll try to get to them at the end. So quickly, a little bit about the Sharing Science program. So Olivia kind of mentioned this, but our whole goal is to help scientists communicate more effectively. We try to provide provide y'all with the skills, tools, whatever you need to help you communicate to any sort of audience, from a family member to a friend to journalists, which is what we're talking about today, to policymakers, to your fellow scientists, really anyone who you might want to talk science about who is not in your immediate field and might not understand some of the more technical terms, phrases, jargon, whatever that might be. And we do this through a number of ways. You're on one of them now. So we have a handful of webinars throughout the year. Our bread and butters are these in-person workshops that I'll talk about more at the end. But like I said, we're connecting with connecting scientists, with all types of different audiences and groups. And so we are part of AGU, the American Geophysical Union, who serves Earth and space scientists, but we in the Sharing Science program really just want to help any scientist who wants to communicate better and more broadly, as I have problems communicating. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to do a quick poll for y'all, and so it actually should have popped up. You should see here, why are you here today? Just take a minute or so. I'm just interested in why folks on the line are here today. Oh, and some of you are answering. Perfect. So yeah, I'll leave this open for probably another 30 seconds or so. All right, leave it open for a few more seconds. Seems like things have kind of leveled off. All right, so we have 74. So a majority of you are here if you just want to understand and be prepared and have a better understanding of what to do, and then tied for second, pitching your research, want reporters to get it right, and then keep getting calls at the end. So seems like a majority of you are just here because you just want to understand more, and that's great, but we're going to cover all of these things in the poll. So the first question, and maybe this is might seem redundant, but why share your research with journalists in the first place? Well, as scientists, we go out and we write manuscripts and do lectures and talk to other scientists, but it's a little bit harder sometimes to actually get that out, get our research out, get our science message out more broadly. So instead of just putting things in a manuscript, reporters, journalists are a good way to help disseminate that message more broadly. Because when you talk with a journalist, they're your audience, but not only the one or say few people, but then they take your work and push it out to tens, hundreds, thousands of different people. So it's a really great way to get your work out to a very broad audience. All right, and we have another one of these polls. Only two, I promise. But so this one is, I just kind of want to gauge on who's done what and how often you've worked with journalists or if you've worked with them at all. So take a few seconds. All right, we'll give everyone a few more seconds. Okay, so it's a little over 50% of you have engaged or have worked with journalists 1 to 5 times, followed by 20% with no experience with journalists, 15 with 6 to 10, and 11% with 11 or more. So it seems like a majority of you are kind of in that, done a little bit, but haven't done it a ton. And regardless of your level of expertise, we hope that there's something on here today that will be useful to you. So before you talk with journalists, before you share your message with them, the question is, well, do you have newsworthy research in the first place? And by that, what I mean is, so all scientific research is important. We're not trying to say that certain pieces of science are better than others from a scientific perspective. However, not all of it is newsworthy. And honestly, a lot of it's not newsworthy. And that has nothing to do with you as a scientist or your abilities or what you're actually doing. It's a matter of what members of the largely non-science public are interested in. So realizing if your research is newsworthy in the first place is the best place to start. And so things like, so what's newsworthiness? What makes something newsworthy? Will it captivate a journalist audience? Because remember, you're not only talking to a journalist, like they're not your primary audience. Their audience is your primary audience. So you want to make sure to put yourselves in the shoes of the reader or the listener or the viewer or whatever the news source is. And so some general criteria for newsworthiness. So is it new? Is it timely? Is it relevant to what's going on? Is it significant? And we mean that from a statistical perspective, sure, but also more so from a public opinion perspective. Is it local? So if you're trying to pitch something to your local paper or radio station or something, is it something in that area? Is it odd or unusual? Does it have a human interest? Are people going to care about it? And does it contain or can it contain superlatives? Now, I know that saying like this is the first or this is the oldest or the best can sometimes be a dangerous place to go. But on the flip side of that, if it's true, if it is truly a first in scientific discovery, that's exciting and people are going to want to know about that. So results that are previously new or unknown, like I said, intuitive, unusual, counterintuitive, they significantly advance a field and relate to things like well-known events or landmarks. Some headlines that we've had that got a lot of uptick. There was this study a couple years ago about sharks having surprising social networks because previously sharks were thought to be very solitary, and that's not necessarily the case, again, depending on the species. Research into Europa, Jupiter's moon, talking about the cliffs of Dover, talking about what actually makes up like the biology behind the color and these beautiful, this beautiful scenery. That really helps as well. And so I touched on this, but impact your daily lives, change our understanding of the universe, and that's very that's big and exciting, but just change our understanding of something that maybe we thought about that was different before. Go against current scientific consensus. This is not necessarily, I'm not talking about denialism or pseudoscience or any of that, but if there is a legitimate discovery that makes us think about something in a different way, and it's good science, that's exciting. And if it can include striking photographs or videos, if you do science that has really great, vivid imagery, not necessarily saying you have to have that, but that does help, especially if we're talking about a print piece or like a video or a media piece like that. And so some examples here. So talking about Harvey, so that's timely right now with Florence. Volcanic lightning got a lot of uptick when one of our colleagues wrote about it in a press release, and then it got picked up by the Washington Post. The gravitational waves discovery a couple years ago. It was a really big deal, but had this great imagery and a lot of really great ways of explaining it. So that's newsworthy, and again, there's probably other things. But on the flip side of that, when is something not necessarily newsworthy? An incremental advance to the field. Very important, super necessary from a scientific standpoint, but journalists and their audience might not be interested in that. Improving a model or a technique or a method or whatever that might be. Again, important, but not necessarily super interesting. Confirmation of what's known. Again, especially now, we're talking about in science, there are issues with reproducibility. There has been some news about this, so that's not necessarily not newsworthy, but a majority of that probably won't be. Summaries, so review papers, and then already been reported in the news media, because once it's out there, it's no longer new, and so it's no longer news. And we have a quick and dirty guide to when science is newsworthy, and also actually there's a handouts tab in your GoToWebinar panel over there, and this is one of the handouts in there as well, so you can take that away, and it's on our website too. So it's kind of just a really quick, good guide if you're just thinking about, oh, is my science newsworthy? So once you know whether your science is newsworthy or not, and you think it is, you think a journalist might want to hear about it, well, okay, what are they going to care about? And for this, I'll give it over to Olivia.
Thanks, Shane. So first, let's talk a little bit about how communicating with the media is a little bit different from communicating with your fellow scientists. One, as Shane already talked about a bit, your audience is different. So obviously when you're talking with other scientists, you share a lot of common understanding of the field, of how you do things. When you're talking to a journalist, again, your audience is everybody who reads that journalist's work or watches their channel or listens to their radio program. And partly because of this difference in audience and because these aren't specialists in the field, reporters are writing news stories in a very different way than the way that we write papers. So when you write a research paper or you're presenting on a scientific topic, you have your introduction, your previous research that you start with, here's what we know, here's why we're looking into this question, what methods you used, and then your results, your discussion, your conclusions. Yeah, when you write a news story, it's very different. News stories start with the results and the conclusions. What was found? What do we understand about that? And then what are the implications of that finding? And then there's a little bit at the end about the research details and methods. And the reason this was done was that first, when news was only in print, if an article was too long to fit on a page, an editor would just snip off the bottom of it. Now, if that happened to a research paper, you miss all of the meat of it. You miss the blood that went into it and the results that you got. If you do that to a news story, on the other hand, you're missing some details, but you're not missing the really important elements that you wanted to carry across. And of course, nowadays, this is just as relevant because people have the attention spans of lobotomized goldfish. So you still want, in a news story, to lead with all of the things that you want people to remember. So another example of this sort of inverted pyramid style is these two titles. So the title of the research article is Quantifying the Daily Economic Impact of Extreme Space Weather Due to Failure in Electricity Transmission Infrastructure. This is basically what we looked at, right? You look at the news story that was based on this research. Solar storm blackout could cost the U.S. $42 billion per day, and the highest economic fallout would impact regions outside the blackout zone. So this is what they found. and its impact on society. Now, this is not to say that when you talk with a journalist, you have to reverse how you talk about what you're saying, just to realize which areas they're going to be placing more of an emphasis on, so that you can be more aware in advance of what they're going to be looking for. Okay, so speaking of that, let's talk a little bit more about developing your message when you're talking with the media. Really important elements that a journalist is going to want to hear from you about your research or want to convey to others is, what do we know, what's new, and why it matters. So to expand upon that just a little bit, what do we know? You're giving the context and the frame of reference. Okay, so why is this area of research important? What do we understand already about it? What's the background that someone outside the field might not know? And then what's new? What did you actually find here? And how does that compare to what we've already understood and what we know already? And then obviously why it matters. What's the societal impact? What's the human dimension? This is the part where if someone's looking at it in a paper and they say, why should I care about this? The answer is already there. So an example of this is a press release that AGU put out a couple of years ago around ocean acidification in the Florida Keys. Excuse me. So for this, what we know was, okay, oceans are absorbing carbon dioxide, which lowers seawater pH, and that can dissolve coral reefs. So they expect to see this happening in Florida around mid-century. What's new is that researchers found that this was already happening. Coral reefs were already dissolving 40 to 50 years earlier than expected. And why does it matter? Well, ocean health is our health too, and we depend upon coral reefs for a lot of economic benefits, from fisheries to protection from storms to tourism. So if they're in bad shape, that's bad news for us too. And as you're thinking about what you want to be able to share with journalists, you also want to prepare what they call your take-home message. I find this phrasing kind of irritating, but it is useful in that basically it's saying, the way I think of it is, if you were to have somebody who'd read an article or listened to a news story about your research, if they were asked 2 weeks later, oh, what was that about? What is the 1 or 2 sentences that you would want them to be able to say that would summarize what you think is most important about your study? So to go back to the coral reef article, in this case, the authors were able to do a couple of these sort of take-home messages. One was, we don't have as much time as we previously thought. The reefs are beginning to dissolve away. And this is one more reason why we need to get serious about reducing carbon dioxide emissions sooner rather than later. Now, if you don't feel comfortable yourself in doing something like the latter, sort of, what we should do, you don't have to. You can just do something that's more similar to the first take-home message. But if there is sort of an action that you want the audience to think about, you can also include that. And then another way to help journalists make their job easier and convey what you're talking about in a really compelling way and vivid way to an audience is to use social math. This is why often museums are really good at this. They talk about how much a blue whale's tongue weighs, maybe it's the size of a car or something. See, I haven't been in a museum in long enough, obviously, but these are the kinds of connections to things that we feel are tangible that help people really relate better to whatever you're describing, because numbers tend to be much more abstract for people who aren't working on them day to day. And at the bottom of this slide, and again, this will be archived later for you, but there are a couple of links that you can go to where these sites will actually help you develop social math for whatever numbers you're working with. And it's really great if you can start off by speaking the same language. So some jargon you have to use, right? Because it's the only way to describe a particular instrument or phenomenon, and you can explain that in simple terms. But if there are other words that are used more commonly that you can substitute for ones that you might use with other scientists, use those instead. So thunderstorms, space, soot instead of black carbon, hurricane instead of tropical cyclone. These are, again, going to make your work more accessible to begin with, both for the journalist and then for the journalist's audience. And none of this just comes out of nowhere, and you shouldn't feel that you have to do this the moment that you're talking with a journalist, either whether one calls you, or because you're trying to pitch it. You can take the time in advance to actually practice, to think about how you would set up, what do we know, what's new, why does it matter, to think about take-home messages, to try to come up with some helpful analogies, if you have some, for some of your work, or share some interesting stories or anecdotes around your work. So you really take the opportunity, if you think you have something newsworthy, to think about these things in advance. It doesn't hurt. And just be aware that when you are interviewed, you're not going to be allowed to look over that story before it goes to print. And this has nothing to do with you. It's that within the business of journalism, as part of journalistic ethics, no one should be able to tamper with the article that a journalist has written, with a news story, essentially. You can, however, make yourself available, say to a journalist, if you have any questions, please reach out to me again before you file the story. I'm happy to answer anything or clarify anything, and then make sure that you are actually available. So there are ways that you can do that. And most importantly, reach out to your public information officers. Sometimes these are called press officers or, media offices or communications offices, but almost every institution has at least one. And these are people whose job it is to get your research out there in the world, and they would be happy to help you best plan how to develop your messages so that they can get out there in the best way possible. And also to help you with this, and I think this is another one of our handouts too that is attached to this webinar itself, but it's also on our website. We have some tips for giving science interviews. Both some ideas for what to do in advance and during interviews, whether they're being recorded or live, and then also a little bit on the back about how to best prepare, how to write down some of those notes that might help you clarify your thoughts and develop a really clear and exciting and accessible message about your research. And with that, I'm going to tell you a bit about what's next.
Thanks, Olivia. Hope that you feel better. So what's next? So from the journalistic perspective and kind of getting your research out there in a way that's accessible and attractive, and this is just kind of a general good rule of thumb. AGU specifically has started giving authors the option of writing plain language abstracts, and they're exactly how they sound. They're abstracts for your manuscripts or your conference presentation in plain, accessible language. And actually, we just did a webinar about this a couple weeks ago, which is on our website. But if you're on social media, if you're on Twitter, we actually highlight some on our account under the hashtag SciSummary. And plain language abstracts are one way that journalists might be able to find your work through social media and find it in an accessible way and maybe read it and say, oh, that sounds interesting. And I'm going to contact this person. So that's one thing that you might want to check out and might want to do, regardless of whether you're an AGU author or not. We have a bunch of resources on our website, so that's sharingscience.aju.org. All the webinars will be archived there, and we'll actually send out an email to everyone when it's up so that you can look at it there. Someone just asked us. But also, if you're interested in policy things, our press office, so Nancy and her colleagues actually compile lists of scientists who have volunteered to be on-call experts when things happen, for example, like Florence. We have a list of hurricane experts who have experience talking to members of the press and are willing to do so. If you want to be considered to be part of this list or interested in doing that type of thing, you can contact us and we can put you in touch with Nancy and her colleagues. Also, they're constantly putting out press releases, like the press release you just saw, which is a really great way to kind of have a go-between between you and a reporter at a science outlet, a major news outlet, whatever it might be. And like Olivia said, working with your public information officers is really important. It can be a really helpful resource. And also we have a couple of blogs as well. We are on social media. These might all seem like shameless plugs, but we actually do share a ton of what we hope is valuable science communication, policy, and outreach materials on there, especially through our Twitter account, the AGU SciComm one. We also have a podcast, and this might seem like a bit of a non sequitur, but it's all about the scientists and the methods behind the science, and it's largely an interview format. So actually, Nancy and myself are the co-hosts, and then we have our colleagues. They will interview scientists to talk to them not only about their work, but about them as people, how they got into science, what they were doing for their research and everything. And so it's actually, we've heard from some folks that it's a really great way to not only learn more about the lives behind the scientists, but also hear some great exchanges between interviewers and scientists, and hear about like how you can interact between these two different folks. So if you're into podcasts, maybe consider that. Like I said, we do webinars, but we also do workshops. And if you think that's something that your institution might be interested in, please feel free to contact us. And then finally, we also have the Sharing Science Network. And this is, if you really enjoy this type of stuff, if you enjoy outreach, communication, policy, whatever it might be, and you want to be a part of a group of people who also really enjoy this and have the opportunity to interact with them virtually through this online community we have, and then also at different events, mainly at our big meeting, we ask that you consider joining. It's personally a lot of fun for us to see all of the scientists talking about everything they do and sharing experiences. And you can hear from your peers and not just us at the AGU. And you don't need to be a member of AGU to join the network. So having said that, we recognize this is relatively short, but we wanted to give you all a lot of time for questions because your experience might be more specific than something we go into. We also have Nancy here, who is a reporter turned public information officer who can answer really anything you might have. So if you have any questions, please type them into the box and we'll try to get to them. So I'll actually ask Nancy a question. So you work with a lot of you work with a lot of scientists and writing press releases, whatever that might be. What's that process look like? Like, how do you find them, or do they find you? And then, like, what happens once a press release is out there? That type of thing.
So here at AGU, we're mainly, as I mentioned, publicizing the research that's published in our journals and also presented at our meetings. But we work with a lot of institutions. You may be at a university or government agency or other institutions. So that's one way we hear about stuff. We hear from your press offices telling us that, oh, there's a paper one of our researchers is coming out with in one of your journals. So that's one way. We're also we're looking through the journals every single day to try to find stuff as well. And like Shane mentioned, those plain language summaries are really helpful to us. I mean, when we're looking through, dozens of papers every day, if it has a really good plain language summary that we can easily see what's going to be, what's in the paper, that's really helpful. And I've actually heard from a lot of reporters that that's super helpful to them too. I mean, they're looking through, a lot of them are also looking through dozens of papers every day trying to find stuff. So we hear directly from institutions. We hear directly from authors, from authors themselves. We have a form that authors can fill out. They can email us at news@agu.org, and we look through the papers and try to find stuff. And we'd love to hear more from authors. If you have a paper, and I think this goes for institutions too. If you have a paper that you've submitted, that's kind of the time to tell your press office if you think it's something that they might want to write about or to tell us. I know it seems early in the process, but the earlier the better. Even if it doesn't get, they'll probably put it on their radar at least, and so they have it there. But once it's been accepted, in our case, our papers are accepted and published online almost immediately, or within a couple days. It's kind of too late sometimes to do it at that point. Reporters can see it and they can write about it, and then if it takes us a couple weeks to get the press release out, it kind of defeats the purpose. So really good to get to them early in the process, either to us or to your press office, or if you're working with another journal, to alert them. So, and then basically what happens from there, and probably similar at your universities, is they'll come talk to you. We'll call you up on the phone and talk to you and ask you kind of similar questions that you'd get asked by a reporter, so we can write a story. Sometimes we might get outside experts to comment on the study, and then we'll write something up, a press release, which is pretty similar to a news story. I guess the one big difference is we will show it to you before we publicize it, because we're publicizing your work and we want it to be accurate and we want it to be something that you're happy with. There may be a little back and forth, of course, between what we're looking for and what you might be looking for, but that is one thing. And then we'd work with you to schedule a good time to put out the release, hopefully to coincide with the publication of the paper so that it gets the most impact. And we send that out to thousands of people on our press list. And I'm sure your universities kind of do the same and get it out to reporters. And there's Eureka Alert, and there's different services. So that's kind of the process. And then once it gets to the reporters, then they kind of start calling and emailing and setting up interviews with you. And that's like the time, and we're talking about messaging, by that point you should have had, one good thing of working with your press office is by the time the press release is out, you should have a pretty good idea, what your message is, based on, you're talking to the press officer and then writing the press release. And so you're ready when those phone calls will come in, almost immediately. That, it happens pretty fast, within probably 24 hours if we put out a press release, or 48 hours. So to be ready with those, your message and your, any anecdotes and things like that. And then, so that kind of sums up, I guess, the process. Is that helpful? I hope?
That was very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So we have some questions coming in. So we actually have a question from a PIO. So Nancy, this might be up your alley again. I'm glad we have you here. What are some tips to help scientists convey the relevance of their science to an audience? I would first say that idea of, is it newsworthy in the first place? So kind of have, I think it's good for scientists to do some, I'm going to call it soul searching. That's probably not the right phrase, but do some like self-reflection on, do I really think this is newsworthy? And kind of going through those steps to figure out if it is or isn't. If it's a straight no, then that is what it is. Something we didn't mention or didn't really touch on that much though. So even if your science isn't newsworthy, that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't have a relationship with a journalist or will never work with a journalist. That doesn't mean that you won't have some newsworthy science in the future. And also you can offer kind of just be a resource for them. So I'm an expert in X. Anytime you have questions on this or want to have an expert opinion or something, please feel free to contact me or whatever it might be. So even if you don't have newsworthy research, that doesn't mean that will be a forever thing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you will never talk to a journalist at all. So I would say the first thing is, the encouraging scientists to really think about whether their work is newsworthy. And then Nancy? Yeah,
I have some tips. I mean, if you're really trying to get the scientists, if you kind of think, I really want to help them to get out why it's relevant, like you kind of have maybe a little bit of a sense, but you want them to kind of expand on that or really to be able to talk to a reporter about that. I mean, sometimes, the scientists will kind of keep very specific, or folks will be very specific in why it's important. But keep taking a step back. Keep asking, well, why is that important? Well, who cares? Like, why would I care? Why should anyone care? If you keep kind of asking that question over and over, and sometimes I know that can sound annoying, but a reporter probably will do the same to try to get it to even that big picture. I mean, a lot of times when we're talking about planetary science, it can be about something so small, so specific, that's happening on, some moon out there, and it seems so specific. But when you really start asking the questions about why does it matter? Well, who cares? Well, why is that important? it gets, everything kind of has a relevance. At the end of the day, it's about, understanding like how our solar system formed. That may seem so big and so vast, but yeah, that's really why you're doing it. You know what I mean? So I think that that's kind of one way to just keep asking that. And, as a PIO, and, you might feel like you're being annoying, but, and as a reporter, that's kind of thing, and as a PIO, kind of to get, and scientists should be aware, you folks on the phone, that, if people keep asking you, it's not to be annoying, it's just that they want to get to the right answer and try to get to help, either helping you kind of get to that point where you can really, explain the greater relevance to why people should care, in a much broader sense.
Great, thanks, Nancy. We actually have, this is a smidge off topic, but I can address this one quickly. We actually have a couple questions about podcasts and podcasting and that type of thing. I will say that in a couple weeks, I think literally 2 weeks in this same time and place, we're actually going to have a webinar on podcasting with myself and one of our scientists who has a relatively successful podcast as well. And so when I send out we'll send up a follow-up email after this when the recording's done and you can access it and everything. I'll send out the details on that webinar as well. And if you come to our annual meeting, we're going to have a whole session dedicated to it as well. So for all of your podcasting questions, stay tuned and we'll have more information for you all soon. Let's see. So we're going to get to this eventually, so we might as well talk about it now. What to do when, what should scientists do when journalists get it wrong? What's like, and the whole way along the spectrum from they get really core facts wrong versus to they're not happy with the way something is presented, but might not factually be incorrect. And what can the scientists do, and how should a journalist respond? Right.
So as I guess as Olivia I think mentioned, most reporters will not let you see, will not share what they're gonna publish with you beforehand. That's just something to understand. But one thing we always tell folks is on the flip side, you can help them get it right even before, so you don't wind up in this situation. And I'll get to the question after this, but just even before you get to that point, I think it's good to understand, to say to the journalist, I'm happy to go over anything you need me to go over with. Because a reporter, if they have a question about a fact, they may email you or call you just to check that fact. That's pretty standard. So say, I'm happy to check over any, not read your story, but if you have any follow-up questions or you have a question about a very specific thing, be a resource. If they email you, email them back. If they call you, call them back, because they may be asking for a follow-up, a clarification, things like that. So be there. And also another thing is when you're going through the interview, if they seem kind of shaky on what you're talking about, ask them, did you understand that? Not in a mean way, but kind of, am I making sense? Is this making sense to you? Keep repeating it. That's the most important thing about these messages, is that you keep repeating it over and over. There's nothing wrong with repeating your main message and the main numbers and the main facts and the things that you want to get right. Think about maybe beforehand what kind of things could get misconstrued or what kind of questions you might get, and have answers to those that are really clear. Maybe afterwards you can even follow up with an email to a reporter, maybe with some of these main facts so they have it in writing. Another good thing is if you are working with your press office, that's a really good way to kind of also head this off, that, there's going to be facts in there. There's going to be, it's going to be written in a way that is going to be very clear and accurate. So that's a really good way. However, if it does get to the point where the story comes out and there's stuff wrong in there, and as Shane mentioned, there's a wide range of what could be wrong. There's a couple things. If it's just not kind of the way you'd say it, or that kind of thing, and you're really not comfortable with how it maybe was framed. that's really frustrating, and that definitely is problematic. But it's, if there's no facts wrong per se, it's kind of best just to let it lie. And I hate to say it, but maybe next time if that journalist calls, you may be able to just say, hey, look, last time we talked, I wasn't that happy with what came out, and maybe you can have a conversation about that. But if there are facts wrong, if your name is spelled wrong, if if there's numbers that are wrong, by all means, you should tell the journalist and get them to correct that. There's nothing wrong with that. But if it's just kind of not the way I do it, maybe it's sometimes best to let those lie until maybe you have another interaction with them and you feel like you want to say something. So does that kind of answer the question? But I think it's good to think about beforehand the things that you can do maybe to head that off so it doesn't happen.
Great, thanks, Nancy. There's another question, and Olivia answered part of it in the chat, but about if you're introverted but you discover your discovery is getting a lot of attention, do you have tips on how to overcome not wanting to be the center of attention? And I think she definitely provided some good tips there. The last thing I would add, and that's for anyone, regardless of how comfortable you are talking to anyone in any format, is practice. And this goes for not just like you're giving a talk or whatever that might be, but even interviewing. We really suggest to scientists that they do what we call mock interviews, where it's how it sounds. You get peers, friends, whomever, to essentially be your audience. And you have them ask you questions like they were that audience. So if it's for, say, a journalist, have them be a journalist from maybe different types of outlets or whatever outlet you think it might be, and have them ask you questions. And so that way, you might not think of all of the questions, you probably won't, honestly, but you are putting yourself in a situation where you're at least comfortable in answering and have a kind of an idea of what to expect. So not to be like the old saying, practice makes perfect, and that's kind of silly, but it's 100% true. So yeah, I would say definitely practice. Another one, and so this is actually something we talk about that we didn't touch on, a question about working for an institution and they're limited on what they can say, but they're asked questions by journalists trying to point them in a certain direction. What's the best way to go about speaking in a certain way, so usually politically, without saying no comment? So how to kind of avoid that and get back to, I guess I'm kind of answering it, get back to the main message.
Right. Oh, you want me to answer this one?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's exactly what Shane said. I think the thing is, so no comment, as you probably all are aware, probably from watching political, press conferences and stuff, that has a kind of a thing that goes along with it. When you say no comment, people think you're hiding something. So it's best not to say no comment, but it's best to say, if that's something that you don't want to answer because that's not your area of expertise, like if they're asking you a policy question and you're not comfortable with asking that, it's totally fine to say, that's not my area of expertise, but what I can tell you is, and go into your own messages. It's okay to say, I don't know the answer to your question, but I can find out and get back to you if there is someone that you can refer them to. Or you do know, one of your colleagues on the paper who was, say you have a paper and one of your colleagues is at a university and they're more comfortable talking about that area. Perfectly fine to say, hey, I'll hook you up with my co-author who can talk more about that. All those are perfectly fine responses to kind of get off, to kind of, I don't want to say deflect, but to questions that you're not comfortable answering. And I think that's another thing to underscore. If you're not comfortable answering it, don't answer it. Don't make something up. Don't try to guess. Don't say, if you're not comfortable answering it, don't answer it. No one can make you answer something that you don't want to answer. Go back to your main messages, and if they keep pestering you, say, hey, look, I really, I've told you before that's not my area of expertise, and I can give you someone else who can talk to you about that. So those are my suggestions. Anything else you wanted to add, or is that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. So another one. I just had it. Oh, so a question more about social media. So, or I guess putting it out there on social media. So what's the best one? Twitter, Facebook, podcast, whatever it might be. I would probably say Twitter. I think a majority of kind of these interactions are happening on Twitter. There are a ton of scientists on Twitter, but also a lot of journalists and science journalists on Twitter. That's not to say it's the only one. There are also organizations are on Facebook and even maybe on Instagram. But I would say Twitter is probably the best venue for that, just because of how many people are on it and the types of folks who are on it. But again, if you're more comfortable with another type of social media, that will work as well. Just Twitter is probably where most of the folks are at. There was one on here. Where did it go? So a reporter writes an article interviewing all the researchers in a certain region about that topic, but doesn't include my institution. So say, so we'll use Florence as an example. On the coast, say like it's somewhere in North Carolina, and goes to researchers at a few institutions, but doesn't hit one of them. What's a good way to kind of get that institution, or say maybe that scientist out there on folks' radar?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think it can hurt to follow up with that reporter and not know, hey, you didn't include me in your thing. Just compliment them if you like their story and you want them to use you again. I mean, you have to realize these reporters, especially if they're writing something like about the hurricane, they're on really tough, very tight deadlines, and it's usually who they could get on the phone at that moment. So, it's nothing I don't think it's slighting anyone if they, reached out to 3 of the 4 institutions and yours was the one they didn't. So, but it's good to compliment them, say, hey, great story. We have folks here too. If you ever, if you're a PIO, I don't know who's asking this question, but if you're a PIO and you just want to say, hey, we have folks here too, feel free to, give them your phone number and your email, drop me a line next time you need someone. And if you're a scientist, I mean, same thing. Say, hey, I'm available, and be available. If it is a breaking news story that's happening, say, hey, loved your story. I'm available all weekend. Here's my cell phone. If that's something you want to do, by all means, I don't think any reporter would ever turn their nose up at that. So I think they really but I would caution not to be, don't kind of point out, hey, you spoke to X, Y, and Z and not me. Just do it in a nice way to realize that the pressure they're probably under. And, there are also some cases where, if you're a scientist and you think, oh, they didn't talk to anyone at my institution, they actually may have, and it just didn't make it into the story. I mean, that's also very, maybe they talked to someone at your institution and they said the exact same thing as the guy down the road. I mean, they can't include everyone's quote in the story. So, that's another thing to just consider before, kind of, pointing the finger or anything like that.
Great. A kind of more logistical question, but is it typical to get interview questions prior to the interview?
Oh, so that's a good question. So it's not typical, but I'd say it's not untypical either. So I'd say it's not typical, but if you ask, I think that in science journalism, most science journalists would be happy to give you a couple questions that they might be thinking about, but be prepared that those are not the only questions you're going to get, that they're going to, they're probably just throwing out some very generic questions, and they're going to delve into things based on what you say, and they're going to ask other questions. But it can't hurt to ask, just so you can be prepared. I mean, that's a really good thing to ask, and most people will throw you a couple questions. But I think what Olivia was talking about was messaging, and we've heard from many reporters. I mean, if you don't get those questions, or the person just calls you up and you're right there, or in a situation face to face, think about the main questions that they're probably going to ask is, what did you find and why does it matter? And if you have those questions kind of figured out, those are the main big questions that they'll probably want to know. But yeah, can't hurt to ask. If they say no, you can't kind of be angry at that either. But it can't hurt to ask, and some people will generally probably throw you a few questions just so you're prepared and they're prepared. That is also an interesting question though. Like if you want to answer questions over email, I think that's fine in some cases, but in a lot of cases, reporters are going to want to talk to you. They're going to get a sense of what you're going to say. They want to get a good quote. They want to hear it as as a person would say it. They want to be able to follow up on things you're going to say. They want to be able to clarify things with you. So, I mean, if you're in out in the middle of you're in the field for 3 weeks and you can't get on the phone and something like that, email is probably acceptable, and some people do that. But I think in most cases, people are going to want to get on the phone with you. So just be prepared for that as well.
And we have someone who said that they've worked with journalists before and had some experience where a journalist would contact them ahead of time, and even before the interview would ask them to kind of some quotes over ahead of time to, I guess, get good quotes for them. And then a lot of other times they haven't really seen that at all, and it was just like a pure interview. So the questions about kind of like what's typical, what's not, it's more the second one, right? You're probably not going to have...
They would call it do like a pre-interview?
Yeah, like via email.
Yeah, and that might be perhaps that's more typical if you're doing TV or radio. That if you're doing maybe a radio interview, maybe they would definitely kind of throw out some stuff so you're prepared. And if it's a live television or radio interview, they probably want you to be pretty well prepared. And that may be what you're referring to. But I'd say that the second is probably more typical, that they're just going to email you and say, hey, can you talk to me today about the study? Or they may even call you on the phone at your office. Hey, I just got a press release about your study, or I just saw your study. You have time to talk, that kind of thing. So I think it's probably don't have time to prepare, but in broadcast that may be a little different. So.
Great. And so they're kind of wrapping up. There were a couple questions about different types of, so help scientists prepare for interviews, different types of interviews. So this is one of the handouts. I'm showing it on the screen that we provided for y'all. You can download it. Tips for science interview. So we tried to, again, this is by no means comprehensive, but we tried to divide it up in ways for live interviews, for recorded interviews, transcribed, video, radio, different types of things. So hopefully this is a good kind of starting point for things to say, things not to say, how to prepare, how to say things, depending on the type and format. And then on the back, there's, like I said, practice, practice, practice. There's some room for you to do that practicing. So talking about like things that you might want to highlight, or what you might want to say, or how you might say it. So hopefully this guide is helpful for scientists, and then also for the interviewers and PIOs out there who want to have good experiences with some folks that they're talking to. And so with that, I think we're going to wrap up. So thank all of you for attending today. Like I said, we'll be sending an email probably next week with the recording and also some follow-up materials as well that we might not have gotten to. In the meantime, if you have a question, you can email us at sharingscience.agu.org. So all that information is here. And thanks again.